Hello again, members. I'm Catherine McMacken, Membership Manager here at the Henry Ford. We're all getting ready for this weekend when we officially open our next temporary exhibit, Lewis Comfort Tiffany, Treasures from the Driehaus Collection. And as the excitement builds, I'm so happy to welcome you back for today's THF conversation for members, Tiffany at the Henry Ford, the exhibition, the man, and our collection. Our own curator of decorative arts, Mr. Charles Sable, is inviting us in for a bit of a preview of the exhibition, highlighting some must-see pieces and providing his insight into Tiffany's life and influences. He's even agreed to share a couple of behind-the-scenes stories about some of the Tiffany treasures in our own collections here at the Henry Ford. I'm very excited to introduce Charles today. Many years ago, as an optimistic art history student, Charles landed his first museum volunteer role researching for a decorative arts exhibit at the Milwaukee Art Museum. And since that early experience, he's devoted his professional life to the genre. And he's been here with us at the Henry Ford for over 10 years, telling the story of American glass from its early days to the 21st century. And we are extremely lucky that today Charles will share some stellar examples of our glasswork and show us some of his favorites from the Driehaus Collection to get us ready to see the exhibit. So as we get started, I hope you'll take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat feature with your first name and where you're joining us from. We can kind of use the chat feature to see each other and our member community there. And while you're enjoying the program, please submit any questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. And as always, to our members, thank you again for your ongoing support of the Henry Ford. We are so grateful that you continue to join us in our commitment to our mission as we're all navigating this new year. So now I'll hand it over to Charles to welcome us into the world of Tiffany.
Thank you. Thanks, Kat. I'm on, right? Oh yeah, I will see the box on my face, around my face, sorry. Welcome everybody. As Kat said, I'm Charles Sable. I'm Curator of Decorative Arts at Henry Ford, and I've been at the museum since 2009. And one of the first, well, the major project that I've worked on in most of my years are the glass galleries. Both the Modern Glass Gallery, the Davidson Gerson Gallery of Modern Glass in the Henry Ford Museum, and the Davidson Gerson Gallery of Glass in Greenfield Village, which was a monumental undertaking over basically about 10 years, almost 10 years from start to finish. So it's truly something. So I'm very familiar with our Tiffany collection, and I'm happy to be here to talk to you about the Driehaus Collection from Chicago. And with that, I'm going to start sharing my screen. If I can find it, here we go. Share. And here we go. Okay, so let's get started. What I want to do today, as Kat said, is introduce you to the exhibit, introduce you to the museum, not our museum, the Driehaus Museum in Chicago, which is a relatively new museum, and then talk about some of my favorite pieces in the exhibit, and then finally finish up with a few examples or one major example of some conservation on a Tiffany piece that we've got in the Henry Ford that will be part of the exhibit. So without any further ado, I'm going to get started. If this thing will work. Okay, there we go. Okay, oops, there we go. Oh, it's this way. Okay, this is the exhibit catalog, and it's treasures from the Driehaus Collection, and you're looking down at one of the great Tiffany lamps in the exhibit. Let's see if I can move ahead. Yes, there we go. And that is Mr. Driehaus on the left. Now, who do you ask is Mr. Richard Driehaus? Richard Driehaus is an investment banker in Chicago, and I'm showing you his office here at the right. And he started collecting Tiffany back in the 1970s, really at the very beginning of his career in investment banking. And if you look in the photo at the right here, you'll see tons of Tiffany all over the place here, vases and things like that. He owns approximately 1,500 pieces of Tiffany, lamps, decorative accessories. Let's look at my notes here. Things that he really attracted to. One of my favorite pieces in this particular image is this incredible Tiffany chandelier. And he just buys these things at auction and just lives with them, as you'll see in the next slide. That is his dining room. Little Rococo for my taste, or actually Louis 15 or 16 for my taste. But notice the Tiffany windows in here. And it looks like a pre-Raphaelite painting, English over here. Silver sconces, quite something. These are some of the earliest pieces on the slide at the right that he collected. Now I'm getting these from the exhibit catalog, which if you're at all Tiffany aficionado, you might want to buy. He furnished his home and his early saloon as he calls it, called Gilhooly's Grand Saloon on the south side of Chicago in the late 1970s. And he really had an affinity, without really knowing too much, about late 19th century decorative arts, Art Nouveau things, posters, Toulouse-Lautrec, etc. And his first Tiffany acquisition was this woman on the moon that is attributed to Tiffany here on the bottom. He likes things, as he says in the exhibit catalog, that are arresting, that have powerful imagery. I'm reading his quote here: a sense of drama with rich, vibrant colors. Those are the kinds of things that appeal to him. So he started with stained glass windows, and I can see as someone who is learning about Tiffany how this thing would appeal to you, and I could also see that in the saloon. This is a church window, which Tiffany was famous for, doing tons of them. Tiffany Studios, I should say, about 1916, 1917, of St. Michael the Archangel. And it's a memorial window, and we're not exactly sure where it came from. It was one of his early acquisitions. Shortly thereafter, he started buying more things. This window here, which also is in the exhibit catalog, is about 1900 or so. It is a little bit later for Tiffany, and it's the Christian soul ascending to heaven. But really, during this time period, he was avidly collecting a lot of stained glass windows, a lot of Tiffany. And one of the most interesting windows that he acquired is this one, which was made late in Tiffany's career, pretty much after he retired, by Tiffany Studios, about 1927. It was made for the electrical pioneer Samuel Insull, who had an office in Chicago. And you can see its electrical power powering the city. It really doesn't look like a Tiffany, although I can see the Tiffany glass, the Tiffany colorations. Notice the sky and the skyscrapers. So it's very late. On the left, I'm showing you what he did, his first effort in public display. And this still exists on Navy Pier in Chicago. It's the Dre House Gallery, opened in 2002, with examples of many of his windows. When I used to go to SOFA in the before times, which stands for Sculptural Objects, Functional Artwork and Design, which was held in Navy Pier in the fall, I used to walk right through these galleries. So early on, and they really do attract your attention. So it's about halfway down on the main level at Navy Pier, facing south. So you're getting natural light coming into these windows. It's just after the amusements and the children's museum as you're leading toward the festival hall. And it's really quite something to see these windows here that he's collected. Next slide. But his biggest acquisition, if you will, is the Nickerson Mansion. As Mr. Driehaus says in the exhibit catalog, his office was across the street. And in the early 90s, this building, the Nickerson Mansion, was the R.H. Love Gallery. So it was an art gallery. But it was built in 1883 for Samuel Nickerson, who was the president of the First National Bank of Chicago. A self-made man who survived the Chicago fire. Yes, it's fireproof, the building, and what is one of these great Gold Coast mansions. It's located on the corner of Erie, which is this street here, and Wabash, which is this street here. So this is looking north. Michigan Avenue is over here. I don't know if you can all see my pointer. So this is Erie Street over here. Really quite something. Really very much of this Chicago version of a New York grand house. And at the bottom, I'm showing you the entry hall. And it's been perfectly preserved through all these years and years and years. The Nickersons lived there until 1900, when they retired. Basically, he retired, and they returned to Massachusetts, where Mr. Nickerson came from. They left it to one of their children who lived there for a few more years. Then in 1919, the house was purchased by a group of wealthy Chicagoans for the American College of Surgeons, which used it as a headquarters. So throughout most of the 20th century, the building was preserved. By about 1963 or so, the American College of Surgeons had outgrown the building and they'd gotten offices further down the street and they started renting it out. So when Mr. Driehaus came along in the 1990s, as I said, it was an art gallery. And he went to look for something there, and he went with a friend, and he says in the exhibit catalog, the friend told him, don't buy the piece of art, buy the building. And that's exactly what happened. In 2003, he bought the building. It was not in great shape. And he spent the next 5-6 years restoring it. And if you look at the museum's website, the Driehaus Museum's website, you will see they get into a lot of the restoration of the building. So the image I'm showing you at the top left is what it looks like pretty much today, although I pulled that offline, off their website, as a matter of fact. So it's a little bit blurry, but you get a sense that it's been cleaned. It was filthy dirty, this building. He's also restored the interiors too, and played around with them and installed his collections in them. So not everything is the Nickersons or original to the building, but it is in the spirit. And what the museum is a museum dedicated to the decorative arts and fine arts of the late 19th, early 20th century, both European and American. So if we look further inside the building, you'll see what I'm talking about. You're looking at a room here at the left, which is filled with his artwork, and into the gallery here at the right. Yes, with a Tiffany dome at the top there, really quite something. Really ornate, really a showplace. Very, very, I don't know what you'd call it. I call it over the top, Victorian myself, but it's really quite something. So the collection is installed there. And the kinds of things they've done are, well, the Tiffany show. They've done posters. I think they have a small exhibit right now of the poster artist Will Bradley from the 1890s. They've done shows on late 19th, early 20th century jewelry. So anything related to the fine and decorative arts that's related to the collection and other materials. And they've been traveling shows too. And fortunately, we've been able to get this show. And in fact, we were offered this show about 6 or 7 years ago. And it was only now that we could fit it into our exhibit schedule. So that's how far out exhibits are booked in time. So it's really quite a wonderful place, and it's kind of hiding. So if you are familiar with Michigan Avenue in Chicago, Tiffany is about a couple of blocks north on Michigan Avenue from this. Again, it's a block west of Michigan Avenue. So all those great shops on Michigan Avenue. I think the closest place that I'm familiar with is the Grand Lux Cafe, which some of you may or may not be familiar with. It's right on that corner of Erie. Okay. Moving ahead. So that's all I really wanted to talk about with the Driehaus Museum. It's wonderful, and I recommend that you go there if you haven't heard about it. And I assume lots of you haven't, because I want to turn our attention now away from Mr. Driehaus to Louis Comfort Tiffany and who he was, where he comes from, and give you a sense of his biography. On the right in this slide, I'm showing you a photographic portrait of Louis Comfort Tiffany sometime in the late 1860s. He was the son of a man named Charles Tiffany. Now, Charles Tiffany was famous for starting the firm of Tiffany and Company. And I'm showing you 2 pieces of silver in our collection made by Tiffany and Company. So Tiffany and Company is the famous jewelry and silver company, makers and retailers that we all know today. They're still on Fifth Avenue, New York. They've been in business since the 1840s. Louis Comfort Tiffany was born in 1848 in Manhattan, the scion, essentially, of this rather wealthy family. And that's really important in understanding what he is all about, because his father wanted to become a member of the company, and he early on developed a strong artistic bent. Although one could argue that the silver produced by Tiffany and Company is very, very artistic as well. On the left, you're looking at what we call an aesthetic piece, This picture, which is in our collection, looks very sort of what we call Anglo-Japanesey in style, with these birds stylized, or this sort of colonial revival coffee set from around 1900. Really quite lovely. And these are things that I wish we could get out, but they don't get out of the museum, unfortunately. We have tons of wonderful things. So that's where Tiffany comes from. Now, early on, he was interested in art, and as the timeline says, in the late 1860s, really started getting an artistic education. Between 1866 and 67, he was a student at the National Academy of Design in New York City, which was an art school as well as an exhibiting gallery space. It still exists. The last time I was there, it was on Fifth Avenue, very close to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He then went to Paris, as most wealthy Americans did who wanted to study art in the late 19th century. He went all over Europe, which was very inexpensive in the 19th century for wealthy Americans to travel. In fact, people would go there just to save money because it was so much cheaper than living at home. The exchange rates were very different back in those days. And this is one of his earliest paintings. It lives in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He also traveled across North Africa, like a lot of expatriate Americans who wanted to study art. This is called Snake Charmer at Tangier, 1872. It's in the timeline of the exhibit. You can see it there. It lives in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Unfortunately, I pulled this slide offline. It's a little washed out, but it gives you a sense of that exoticism, that Orientalism. That's what we call it in art history. People looking for the exotic cultures, which was a mainstream in American fine arts and decorative arts in the last half of the 19th century. These are the kinds of things that will be shown at the Royal Academy in London, the great gallery shows at the Louvre, the official academy, that so much that the Impressionists were rebelling against these sorts of things. So this is typical of what we call academic art, art that we shown in the academies of the late 19th century. It is very good. I mean, he was a good painter, Tiffany. A lot of people don't know that he was a great painter. He studied with George Inness as well, and Samuel Coleman, who he later worked with. These were academic artists working in New York City. So he was trained by them, and he comes through this academic tradition. But don't forget, whenever we're talking about Tiffany, you have to realize where he comes from. He was an aristocrat, an American aristocrat in the late 19th century. So he behaved in certain ways and lived a very certain lifestyle that was inculcated in him from these early days in the 1860s and 1870s, when he attempted to become a fine artist. Because what happens is, by the mid 70s, he starts experimenting with glass, okay? In New York, in Brooklyn, a glass house he starts working with, and he and a bunch of his friends and teachers gets together and forms an association, or a company really, called the Associated Artists. And they started doing interiors, much like the English designer, craftsman, William Morris, who created a company called Morris and Company, about 10 or 15 years earlier in England. They looked at interiors as something to change society and to decorate with and change the world, essentially. Now, Tiffany did not want to do that. He wanted to create his own aesthetic interiors. And one of his first commissions, in fact, one of the great commissions that the Associated Artists had, was for a bunch of rooms for President Arthur in the White House in Washington, D.C. And I'm showing you the entryway that they did in 1881. All of this is a glass screen, okay? This business here, and I wish I had a color image of it to show you. And this is what the same space looks like today. What happened was, this was all done up in a very Victorian taste. And most people don't realize that the White House was constantly being redone in the 19th century. And Tiffany and his group really did a job on it, shall we say. It doesn't look like anything we would think of the White House looking like today. In 1902, when President Roosevelt came into office, he hired the Beaux-Arts firm, the classical revival firm of McKim Mead White, another New York architect, to come in and restore the White House. And so what we think of the White House today is pretty much what the McKim Mead White firm did in 1902. They also added the West Wing. So that's when the Oval Office was added. Didn't exist in 1881. It was just the main, what we would call today the residence. So here you're looking through to the East Room over here, and you can see all this white on white, very stark, very, I would say, early 20th century classical revival. Very important what Tiffany is doing here, because this lays the groundwork, especially this screen, for what we're going to see as we move ahead. Now, Associated Artists sort of does well, sort of doesn't do that great. But what Tiffany does do is still continue his interest in glass. And he exhibited the painting I showed you, I'm sorry, backing up a little bit, in 1878 at the Exposition Universelle in Paris. So he went back and forth a lot. But really, by the time we get to the late 80s, he's really interested in glass. And he goes to the next World's Fair, the 1889 World's Fair in Paris, and sees vessels like what I'm showing you here by the great French glass artist Emile Gallet, and goes basically gaga for them. Loves this stuff and says, how does he do it? This is with a French glass artist, and said, I want to do something like this. And he goes back to America, keeps working on designs for both interiors and glass. And in the 1890s, he starts his own decorating company, Tiffany Glass and Decorating Company, in New York, and starts to create glassware. And he starts to experiment. He creates a glass factory in Corona, Queens, Long Island. Important to remember that. This is still in New York City we're talking about. It was what was then the outskirts of Queens, sort of near Flushing Meadows, just east of there. So just east of LaGuardia Airport, where it is today. That's where this glass factory was. And he hires glass makers from England to run it. And he starts experimenting with the glass makers. Not he personally, but he starts looking at new ways of creating glass. And one of the things he looks at is the weathering, what we call the iridescence, the shimmering of what you find in ancient Roman glass, like the bottle I'm showing you at the left, that has been buried for almost 2,000 years. This is the 1st century AD Roman glass. And you see what I'm talking about with that iridescence on the surface, that shimmering. And in fact, it changes the way the light hits it. And he wants to reproduce that, wants to try to recreate this wonderful iridescent quality in glass through chemicals, basically. What we would today call toxic chemicals. It's very hard to reproduce this today without killing yourself, basically, or injuring yourself. So he starts doing that in the early 90s. And then he goes back to the Europeans. By the mid-90s, he's starting to produce wares, and there's a new art movement that's growing in France that really begins in the late 80s, early 90s. We call it today the Art Nouveau. And the name comes from this shop that opened in Paris in the mid-90s by a guy named Samuel or Siegfried, depending on your source, Bing, sometimes called the Art Nouveau Bing, because he really popularized it. He brought artists together, decorative artists, fine artists, and would have exhibits and sell the stuff in this place. And it was very much emphasized in botanical forms, whiplash lines. The idea was to create a new modern art for the emerging 20th century. Really important to remember that. So they allied themselves with modern artists. Now, Tiffany didn't necessarily do that. He never talked about that, but he did sell his wares through this place and exhibited with them, went back and forth. And in fact, the European glassmakers learned a lot about iridescence from him and vice versa. And in fact, decorative art scholars still debate which way the influences went between Tiffany and the French artists or the Austrians. There's a company called Lutz, L-O-E-T-Z. We have a great piece in our collection, which unfortunately I'm not going to show you today. That's another great place where art glass was produced. And that's what we call this stuff. This is a good example. This is in the exhibit, the vase I'm showing you at the left. This is a piece of Tiffany. Notice the squiggly lines, all that Art Nouveau stuff I was just talking about, but it was added with mounts, silver gilt and plaqué azure, which is basically an enameling process, a French enameling process, and it's opening the window, I think it's what it's called, opening the day, with these details here. Can you see these squiggling lines, these organic shapes? They're based upon plant motifs, but they're really gone beyond it into pure abstraction. He exhibited these things at Samuel Bing's Salon de l'Art Nouveau, Salon of the Art Nouveau, at the Paris World's Fair in 1900. This vase was made about 1898. It's likely it could have been exhibited here in the Salon de l'Art Nouveau. I'm not saying this one was, but I'm thrilled to tears that we have this in the exhibit, because it's really a tour de force of exactly what these artists were looking for. Tiffany with the French and vice versa. So it's a cross-fertilization is what I'm talking about. Really quite incredible of what's going on at this time period. Because Art Nouveau exists both in furniture, architecture, pretty much everything. Posters, all over the place. Jewelry, and we've got some great pieces in the collection. Now, what happens to Tiffany is that the firm redevelops. He gets more and more into decorative arts and lighting, especially as we get into the late 90s. 1897, he starts a bronze foundry at Tiffany Furnaces in Queens, in Corona. He renames the company in 1900 Tiffany Studios. So instead of Tiffany Glass and Decorating Company, it's now all Tiffany Studios, and he goes big time. So the period between 1900, about World War I, 1910 to World War I, is the heyday of all this stuff. People love it. Of course, it's high price. I mean, the only people who could really afford this stuff in America were middle class and higher. It was expensive. You would get this stuff through his own shops, and I'll show you a little bit later as we get through. He himself decides to move out to the country, and he builds this incredible fantasy house, which I'm showing no longer exists. It's called Laurelton Hall. It was called Laurelton Hall. It's sort of exotic with a mixture of styles. You're seeing the loggia, which is now installed in the American wing, and that's the upper view here at the upper right, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. So here's Augustus St. God, the statue of Diana from Madison Square Garden. It's really an incredible thing here. And there are all these great Tiffany windows from Laurelton Hall. Here's a sort of washed out portrait of Tiffany, still painting. It's about 1911 when he was 63 years old. So this is where he goes to really respite, really. He's supervising everything, but he's not designing a whole heck of a lot. He has a lot of people designing for him, and recent decorative art scholarship is showing some of these people what they did in designing. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So it's on Oyster Bay, which is on the north shore of Long Island, so just east of New York City. And as I said, the house no longer exists. It burned in a fire in 1957, and significant portions of it have been saved. Some are in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Some are in the Morse Museum in Winter Park, Florida, near Orlando. That's where you can really see tons of this place, furniture and sort of things like that. Now, I want to get into, unless there are questions at this point. Any questions? I don't see anything in the chat, but I don't know if I can see the chat. Okay, we'll keep going. I want to show you some of my favorites from the exhibit. And I'm going to break it up by category. So we're going to start by vases. And these wonderful, wonderful vases are everywhere in the show. That's probably the largest number of items that Mr. Driehaus has. These floral forms, and you can see this Art Nouveau element here, laid out very carefully. On the right is one of his most unusual vases, the Narcissus Paperweight vase. So it's done with a paperweight technique where glass is layered over the surface as opposed to blown here at the left. And these are really quite wonderful. They remind me of contemporary studio glass paperweight vases. This Narcissus is really quite something. And this would have been, if you had some of these in your house, it would have been extraordinary to have one of these vases in your house. Let's move ahead. Yes, This is one of my favorite of all time. This is where the iridescence goes crazy. And this Jack in the Pulpit vase. This is uniquely Tiffany. Very few other companies made anything quite like this. And I love this image because it really shows that incredible iridescence that I love, and I think a lot of people love about Tiffany. So as you can see the dates in these pieces, notice that they're all just post 1900. Let's move on to decorative objects. This is where you bought Tiffany's stuff. This is one of his showrooms in New York City. And I pulled this offline, I believe. It's also in the exhibit catalog. So you can see some of his table lamps here. I love all the furniture here. He sort of mixed and matched the furniture. But what you're really buying here are these wonderful desk sets, boxes, decorative objects of various sorts. This is what most people could afford if they bought Tiffany. Desk sets, pens, inkwells, writing implements, etc. And this was in 1913, and I believe this is on 6th Avenue or Madison in New York City. There's some windows up above here. You get the gist, I think. This is what you would buy there. This is in the exhibit. This elaborate enamel jewelry box with mother of pearl. I'm not exactly sure what all this stuff is on the top here, so I'm showing you the detail of this. Again, Art Nouveau designs, more regularized, I think, in this case, but it's a little bit later. Really quite elegant. So you would put this on your desk as a showpiece, or your jewelry box, I should say, as a showpiece. These are really wow pieces. This inkwell box with what we describe is, what he described, I should say, as Tiffany is jewels, these wonderful iridescent elements. So they are pressed into a mold and then added into the jewelry box here. It looks almost like it's been buried since the Middle Ages or something. Very exotic looking. Or the wire work on this humidor. Humidor is a box of some sort to hold the temperature humidity for your cigars or cigarettes. And that's what this thing was intended for. So this is blown glass with wonderful sinuous wire work all over the exterior. And a very wonderful, what we call patinated or aged top to it. So you'd lift up the lid on this thing and your cigars or cigarettes would be kept in here in this wonderful humidor. Again, these are all in the exhibit. Metalwork, candlesticks. These are wonderful examples of pieces of glass mounted in these organic, highly organic candlesticks. These are in the exhibit. The piece on the right here is a candelabrum that lives in our collection. So this lives in Greenfield Village, this candelabrum in the glass gallery. And I couldn't resist putting it here because it's one of my favorite pieces from our collection. It is truly a stunner, and you can see the wonderful glass enamel panels here. And there's a little snuffer that lives right in here. It's hard to see it in this photograph, but it lifts right up over here, right where I'm pointing. So it's been here since 1980, this piece. So if you see a number, by the way, next to anything I'm showing you, that means it lives in our collection of Henry Ford. Okay, let's talk a little about furniture. There is furniture in the show. I've only got time, I'm watching my time here, to talk about one piece. And I couldn't not put this in. It's a fire screen, and it's the Lily's fire screen. It is truly incredible how this is done with the stained glass and the caning. So what Tiffany's designers are doing, because I doubt Tiffany did this himself, is taking images of lilies, drawing them out on a piece of paper, and there's some in the exhibit catalog, and then laying them out in strips of glass. Usually women did this, and we'll talk about that more in a few minutes. Laying these out for Tiffany, and then printing these wonderful iridescent windows in this case. Really remarkable and very stylized, or what decorative arts historians call conventionalized, meaning abstracted. And of course, this just glows with all that wonderful iridescent quality of the light. Now, Tiffany produced a lot of proprietary types of glass. The exhibit gets into them in great detail. I don't have the time to do it, unfortunately, here, because they're quite wonderful. Ripple glass, I already mentioned the jewels that he did. There's drapery glass, and he's using, not he, his people are using all of this stuff to create these elaborate windows. And let's take a look at lamps. Yes, speaking of the people who work for him, on the upper left, I'm showing you the gentleman who are now making lamps. He really didn't start making the great lamps that we associate with him until about 1898, 1899, 1900, till he buys the foundry to create the brass bases and also the leading, which were introduced by this woman right here on the bottom left. Her name is Clara Driscoll. And Clara Driscoll led the cutting department and was the leader of what were called the Tiffany Girls. This is a new area of scholarship that began about less than 10 years ago. A great decorative arts historian named Martin Eidelberg and several other colleagues at the New York Historical Society discovered letters in a diary of Clara Driscoll, who had originally come from Ohio. She was a single woman. She went looking for work. Actually, she was a single woman because she was a widow. And at that time, it was very difficult for women without means to make a living. So she went to work for Tiffany, starting to do design work for him in the late 1880s and continued. Now, Tiffany believed very strongly that women have a much better color sense than men. And Clara Driscoll started to design in late 1890s lamps and had the women, here she is again on the slide at the lower right, women lay out the pieces of glass. They didn't actually fabricate the lamps. The men did this over here at the top here. But you can see women in the slide at the upper right here, this image, laying out the pieces of glass in the women's cutting room. Really incredible. That's what the Tiffany factory, if you want to call it a factory, it's more like a workshop, looked like. These all are from the first decade of the 20th century. And this is the kind of things they made. This is Clara's first design. There's one of these in the exhibit. This is the one that we own at the Henry Ford. And I think ours is actually better than the Driehaus Collection piece. Can you see the daffodils here? She's experimenting. So in the exhibit catalog, they show you a photograph of one of her daffodils that she'd actually taken to lay out to really create the template for this design of abstracted daffodil forms, shimmering with this wonderful iridescent glass. This is an incredible piece that we've got. I think it really shows it at its best. When I first saw this lamp, it's been here since 1961. I said, ugh, awful. It was monochrome. It had been so dirty from sitting in somebody's attic before it came to the Henry Ford that it was just literally monochrome. And our conservators worked on this for about a year before we exhibited, cleaning it up and getting it to this point. So you're seeing it at its best. And of course, Tiffany lamps were meant to be seen lit. And that's how you're seeing this lamp, with this wonderful sort of glow ensconcing your room. It wasn't about lighting your room. It was about creating a sense of an ambiance, an environment for your room. Really quite incredible. And that's what you're seeing in its very, very first. This is about 1902. She first starts creating this. And Clara goes crazy. This is in the exhibit. It's a little washed out in this slide, but you can see the base of this lily pad base that Tiffany just loves. And look at the dragonflies. This is one of her great lamps. She also did lamps in wisteria, peonies, and there's lots of them in the exhibit. My favorite is her spiderweb lamp, which is not in the show. But I think you can see the jewel up here, right where I'm pointing. Here they are over here at the left here. And with this wonderful iridescent lamp and all this great leading. So that's what the women would do. The Tiffany girls would lay this out and men would actually fabricate the lamp, okay? This one is truly extraordinary. It's a little bit earlier. It's his fish and waves lamp. It's about as Art Nouveau as you can get. It's totally organic. So cast bronze base and not leaded shade, blown. I'm not sure how he got all these wonderful organic shapes up here. It is truly modern, truly original design. One could argue has some background to the Rococo in the 18th century here with all these squiggles and things like that. But I've never seen anything like this. So this is truly an incredible piece that's in our exhibit, or in the Driehaus exhibit, excuse me. One more that I couldn't resist not showing you. Lily pad lamp, 1902. Not a Clara Driscoll design. It's not leaded, but it is truly exceptional. And it's what I consider one of the great quintessential Tiffany lamps. And here you're seeing the base. Now, again, all cast bronze, possibly applied to the base here. You're seeing the light switch over here at the bottom right. And here is a catalog in the upper right of the Turin, Italy industrial exhibit from 1902 with one of these lamps, actually a group of Tiffany lamps here. And here's the 18 light lily pad lamp here as well. Yes, the last showstopper in lamps is this, the Nautilus shell centerpiece lamp. This was probably a private commission. I won't say positively. There are very few of these around, and it is truly something. This is all through, so I'm showing you a detail here at the right of one of these panels over here, and this is all done in 3 dimension. So these are little hooks holding the glass panels together. Tiffany jewels up in here, and the whole thing is just quite incredible. This was meant to be a showstopper, and it's about 1910, as I say here, the catalog says. All mother of pearl, this business here. And I'm not sure what went in these things here, probably flowers of some sort, but truly quite incredible. And I definitely wanted you to see this. One last piece, one of his great floor lamps, and we're getting toward the end here. This is the Snowball Floor Lamp from 1903, and these are floral elements here. You can see the leading. Many of these lamps were meant to be, or most of them were meant to be interchangeable. So you could order a base and whatever you want. And if you wanted to upgrade, shall we say, you could change the shade on the lamp and get something fancier. That may or not be the case here. A lot of times these are original base to shade, but they could be changed. Really quite something to see. Again, wonderful iridescence here, wonderful leading. And one last example, which is truly my pride and joy. This is in the exhibit. This is what this lamp looked like when I first arrived at the Henry Ford. This ugly black and white photograph here at the left is one of Tiffany's first leaded glass floor lamps. Dates to right around 1900. So I ran across this in a storeroom, one of our storage rooms, up in one of the towers of the museum, and said, oh my gosh, this thing's incredible. And started looking at and thinking about using it out in the glass gallery in the village. This is Tiffany's price book over here of what this lamp looked like. 2 slightly different versions of it. This is what it looked like in conservation, in our conservation department, without the shade. Now, if you're looking at this thing, you see the base looks kind of weird. And that's what I kept saying. I thought, that base looks awfully weird. And as we started researching it, the lamp, and looking at the file, we realized that it was missing its outer base. And that's one of the reasons it had never been exhibited. It came in 1966, and you see that over here. Here's the accession number, and it's been sitting there. And in 1967, my predecessors realized that it didn't have a base. Now think about it. In the 1960s, scholarship on Tiffany was very, very limited. Tiffany had only started to come back in style in the late 1950s, as the exhibit tells you. So they didn't know what to do with it. So we started researching and ran across these 2. So if you see the shades are different than ours has its original shade. These have been replaced, but they're pretty much the same base. And if you look at these bases, you'll see that they have their outer base with these sort of like ball feet over here. So our conservators started looking at great detail of these bases. Here's our base. And our conservators use computer-aided design, that's what these are, CAD designs, to recreate the base. And fortunately for us, Ford Motor Company offered to 3D print the base for us. And that's what it looks like today. So all cleaned up, all lit up. As you can see, it's a wonderful Art Nouveau floor lamp. It burned kerosene, which was unusual. Not unusual for an 1890s Tiffany lamp, but unusual for a floor lamp. And it was never converted to electricity. Notice the wonderful green, sort of golden hue as it's lit up, and all these wonderful Art Nouveau elements here. Oops, sorry, I didn't want to go too far, but you get the gist, especially with this base. And you can see these squiggles. Looks like a lot of the stuff we've been seeing back with the Art Nouveau in the 1890s. And with that, I want to finish up because I've given you a nice introduction to the exhibit. You understand the Driehaus Museum, and I'll be happy to take questions. Oh, getting close to time now. Kat, you want to take it over?
Yes, thank you so much, Charles. It's a really fantastic look at Tiffany glass. There's so much beauty in the pieces, and I can't wait to get into the exhibit to see them in person as well. And I do have, it's a good reminder for all of us today that we have our special members only preview of the exhibit Friday, March 5th. So hopefully we'll see some folks there. And now we have time for a few questions. We have loads submitted that came in during the presentation. So we'll get started right away with one that actually came in about Mr. Driehaus and his interest in Tiffany. Why did he start collecting Tiffany pieces?
What I've read in his in the exhibit catalog is he was looking for something to decorate. First his apartment, and then that saloon on the south side of Chicago. And he was attracted to this stuff, to the sort of late 19th century stuff. And he grabbed the Tiffany, that first Tiffany window, the woman on the crescent moon, that was his first window. He thought, this is fantastic. I love it. And it was like a bug. It bit him, and he started buying more and more and more and more and more. Okay?
Absolutely, a collector.
Mm-hmm.
So now a question moving kind of back to Tiffany the man, and well, actually it looks like more materials. Roughly how many different types of glass did Mr. Tiffany develop for his pieces?
Dozens, okay? Maybe hundreds, okay? If you want to see the types of glass, there's a wonderful collection in Queens, New York called the Neustadt Collection, Neustadt. Look them up online. You can go through. They have tons of Tiffany, just the raw glass in their archive, and you can see it all online. So I think we talk about 8 or 9 different types in the exhibit. Ripple glass, draper glass. I would say into the tens or maybe hundreds.
Wow. Next question, are there any prominent Tiffany collectors or admirers in Metro Detroit or the state of Michigan? And have you visited any local private collections? And then there's kind of a third part to this question too. When did Tiffany interests spread beyond NYC into the Midwest?
Okay. To answer the first part of the question, I'm not familiar with any big Tiffany collections in the metro area, but I haven't gone looking for them. If you ask me about studio glass, I can tell you lots of them. But in Tiffany, I'm not familiar with them. So if anyone's a Tiffany collector, oh, I am familiar with one. I take that back. I've been to one art glass collector, not necessarily Tiffany, up in Bloomfield Hills. But that's about it. What was the next part of the question?
Oh, absolutely. When did Tiffany interests spread beyond New York City into the Midwest?
Late 1960s, early 70s. That's when it really goes crazy. Museum exhibits start really in the 60s. The first one was in the late 50s. I believe in the mid 60s, the Museum of Modern Art, New York City, produced a major exhibit and exhibit catalogs. That's how the diffusion of interest in Tiffany really got going. By 1970s, you have Barbara Streisand, okay, and her Art Nouveau house, okay, which was full of Tiffany. And she drove the prices up on Tiffany lamps and things like that. So it's really between 1960 and 1980 that people go crazy. And Art Nouveau is very much a part of that. I'll be giving a lecture on that very topic, Tiffany and American Culture, as part of our Facebook Live in a couple of weeks, okay?
Excellent. I know
I'll be talking about that very topic.
Excellent. Next question, were all of Tiffany Studios lamps designed to be electric from the beginning, or did they design for gas and retrofit?
The latter, okay? In the 1890s, they were all kerosene burners, like ours, okay? But right around 1900 or so, he starts making electric lamps, okay? Very actively interested in electric lamps and the new technology. He figured it out really early on. The electricity was going to be here to stay. He actually worked in the 80s with Thomas Edison, making some electric lights for a theater in New York City. So he knew about it, but most people used kerosene. It's only after 1900 that you start getting electricity going big time. That's why I'm kind of surprised that our Tiffany lamp, our big floor lamp, the one I showed you, it was never converted to electricity.
Oh,
But a lot of them were.
That's a
Good
surprising
question,
connection
whoever
to
asked that.
Edison.
Thank you.
Yeah. Next question, how would you know if a piece was Tiffany's? Did he have a signature or something that indicated that he made it?
Yes, the answer is yes. Tiffany pieces are always marked, either LCT, Tiffany Studios, whatever. You're going to find a mark. Now, the hard part with that is, as anyone who's watched the Antiques Roadshow knows, there are lots and lots and lots of fakes out there. So you really have to go to reference books and look at them. And even then, you might have to bring it to an appraiser or a connoisseur, okay, to really know if what you've got is a real Tiffany piece or not, okay? Tons and tons of modern fakes. I hate to say it.
There's so much expertise involved.
Yep.
This is an interesting question now. Was Louis Comfort Tiffany supported in his artistic endeavors by his family?
The answer is yes. His father was supportive. Don't forget, they're extremely wealthy, okay? His father's like, go for it. You want to be famous? You want to do your own thing? And certainly by the 90s, his father was still alive and he's getting all this stuff going and doing all sorts of other things. Yes, the answer is absolutely, positively yes. And his father dies in 1902, and Tiffany becomes one of the directors of Tiffany Company and does design work for them too. Oh, wow. Okay, but please keep in mind two separate companies. Mm-hmm. Okay, Tiffany Studios, Tiffany Company.
Absolutely. Next, assuming that Tiffany did not do a lot of the actual glasswork himself, did he do the designing and then any kind of approval of the artist's interpretation of his work?
The answer is yes. He did a little bit of design work himself. There are some great lamps that we attribute to him, but he approved everything. If something's going to go out with his name on it, oh yeah, he's going to approve it. And he had lots and lots of people working for him. There was a guy named Arthur Nash who was basically running the shop for him in the Tiffany furnaces in Corona throughout most of the run. Okay. Now Tiffany does retire about 1919 and goes to Laurelton Hall and just hangs out there and sort of lets things drift after that point. He died in 1933, right when the Depression hit. So everything gets shut down at that point.
I can only imagine what it must have been like to work for him and with him, and what an incredible experience.
It would have been. Clara Driscoll does write about that. And you can read, there's a wonderful book called New Light on Tiffany, Clara Driscoll and the Tiffany Girls. It's a wonderful book, published about 2010, New York Historical Society.
Excellent. Next question, what percentage of Tiffany pieces were actually designed by Tiffany himself, and how involved really was he?
He approved everything, as I said. He designed some, but I don't think that much personally, but that's a value judgment I'm making, okay? A Tiffany scholar could tell you the exact percentage that he or she thinks, but we don't know who designed a lot of stuff, okay? But there was an awful lot of things made, so he had lots of people working for him. He wouldn't have had the time to do it, even if he wanted to.
Because of the volume, right? Yeah. Here's an interesting question that touches on, during your presentation, you were saying that the pieces were not necessarily affordable for everyone. And this question is, were Tiffany's artisans able to afford any of their own creations?
No. And a word, no. They weren't paid very much, especially the women. Okay? They couldn't have afforded this stuff. So, no. It's middle class and upper class, okay? Good question. Keep them coming. Let's throw me a few more.
Okay, here we go. Here's the next one. Is there any connection between Tiffany and Pawavik pottery? Both used iridescent colors, just wondering.
Yes, that's a good question. Mary Chase Stratton Perry starts a few years later. So she's getting going around 1903, 4, 5. She would definitely have been aware of Tiffany. Oh my gosh, yes. Everybody knew who Tiffany was, okay? And so that was an influence, but she's working in ceramics. Although Tiffany did have a ceramics studio. We have a great piece of Tiffany ceramics in the collection. So she would have been aware of him and would have been an influence, but she was off doing her own thing for the most part. Pawavik was doing their own thing, and they were part of a slightly different world, the ceramics world, but still very much part of the avant-garde aesthetic world of the early 20th century. So yes and no is what I'm trying to say. Okay.
Absolutely. Next, where were the Tiffany retail stores around the country?
Okay. There weren't any Tiffany retail stores around the country. You went to New York to his retail stores, or you purchased Tiffany through a local retailer, high-end retailer, like J.L. Hudson's, okay, in Detroit. In other cities, it would have been the May Company, say in St. Louis or Los Angeles. Bullock's in Los Angeles. I'm just thinking of other big department stores. You get the gist. Marshall Fields in Chicago. He actually did Marshall Fields. That's still the building that's still standing. Now Macy's on State Street in Chicago. There's a wonderful Tiffany mosaic on the top in a dome. So there would have been a boutique, or boutiques, I should say, plural, within Marshall Fields, where you would have purchased the stuff. You see what I'm saying? So that's how you bought Tiffany if you didn't live in New York City or wherever.
It's also elegant. I think we have time for one last question. This is kind of another multi-part question. First is, why was Tiffany so popular? And then how did he get so popular so quickly, but then go out of style so quickly?
Really good question. It's about the nature of style itself. Okay, when he's getting going in the 90s, the Art Nouveau is the hottest thing. Okay, plus the cachet of the French. Okay, Americans are still very much enamored at that point of French and continental design. So he hooks up with Samuel Bing, as I said, pretty much early on, even before that, by the 90s. So Americans want the latest in European taste. And here's a guy associated with a famous jewelry silver company, the same name, selling this stuff. It's the latest. Now, what happens to Art Nouveau is after 1900, it starts to fall out of favor ever so slowly. In Europe, faster, America slower. Tiffany continues right up and through the 20s. So certainly by World War I, this stuff is very passe, but Tiffany's still doing it. So a lot of people still like it. People like the iridescence, that sort of look, that sort of modern aesthetic. But after 1910, certainly by World War I, you get what we call the colonial revival coming in. People looking at the American past, American colonial architecture. Henry Ford is a good example of that. He first hired Frank Lloyd Wright to do Fairlane, which was in a very modern aesthetic. By 1914, when it starts getting built, it's done up by this William Van Tyne from Pittsburgh in sort of a castle. Okay, very strange. So he's a good example of changing tastes. So by 1910, between 1910 and 1920, it all goes out, and Tiffany is still doing this stuff. Okay.
Wow. Well, I think that's the last question. So
that's it. Okay.
Thank you so much, Charles. And to everyone joining us today for another special member program. You all know we love to share our passion for history and for the Henry Ford with our members, and we're so grateful that you continue to connect with us in our virtual programs. If you enjoyed today's program, I hope you'll join us again in a few weeks for our next THF conversation for members. We'll be previewing the newest permanent exhibit coming to the museum, Driven to Win, Racing in America. So as we wrap up today, thank you again to all of our members for all that you do to support the Henry Ford, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.